So let's take a look into 2011. Now, I cut this a little differently, okay, because sometimes I bore myself. But typically, you go through and you say, well, interest rates are going to do this, inflation's going to do that. I tried to tie it into the overall theme. So let's decompose, if you will, or deconstruct the U.S. economy and try and figure out what areas of the economy are really working, what's leading us right now, and that'll tie into the broader theme. So those of you who were here last year, I'm not lazy. This is a slide you saw last year, but it's so important I had to bring it back. Forget political rhetoric. Forget what's going on, well, not necessarily Saudi Arabia. Forget, anything else that you're really paying attention to in the papers. What's driving what's happening on the planet right now, and I guess the Middle East would be symptomatic of this, is the conversion of global living standards. You, as Americans, end up with per capita GDP of about $47,400 per year. You're the envy of the planet. There are some smaller Scandinavian countries with higher per capita GDP, but for a big country, you are the envy of the planet. The BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, enjoy a standard of living 15% of the standard of living you enjoy, okay? So if you're in Russia, and you've got tons of oil, by the way, your standard of living is about 15, 16,000. If you're in Brazil, and you've got, by the way, a lot of agricultural resources in Brazil, you're at about 11,000. In China, you're at 7,500 or so. And in India, you're down here at 3,400, and you're struggling with food inflation, et cetera. And so what is happening is these countries are trying to mimic what we're doing. Remember, that was the big theme last year. Now, what is global theoretical economic potential? I mean, I tire of hearing, well, we've made all the money that we can possibly make. I would argue we hadn't even started yet, okay? So if you take the U.S. standard of living and you apply theoretically that everybody on the planet suddenly lives like you do, 6.8 billion people coming aboard would generate a theoretical economic potential for the planet of $300 trillion. To put that in perspective, we're at $70 trillion today, and so theoretically we could be 400% larger than we are today. Now, I said this to Stacy in bed one night, and she said to me, I don't believe you, there's got to be some study to articulate this better, and I said, there is, I'll find it. Yes, we do macroeconomics in bed. And so I found this study from PricewaterhouseCoopers and the World Bank, okay? And what they did was they took this general line of thinking, they pegged the U.S. standard of living at 100, and then they went across the planet projecting out what other countries' standard of livings might grow to by 2050. So just for orientation, if you're living in Japan this year, you're living at about 71% of the U.S. standard of living. By 2050, you're at 79%, so things have gotten a little bit better. But that's not the story. The story, again, is this 40% of the global population. So China's at 14% today, as we demonstrated. They'll be at 45% by 2050. India goes from 7 to 28. Brazil goes from 22 to 41. And ultimately, Russia, bye-bye communism, goes from 42 to 74. That's a whole lot more economic capacity, a whole lot more demand that's arriving on the world stage. Okay, just to get a little bit more in depth on this. This is a great study that was put out by the Conference Board recently. What I've done is I've segregated the last 10 years data, what we've actually achieved, and the next 10 years projections, okay? So let's start with the United States. The United States in the last 10 years grew GDP by 1.6% annualized. Not good. That was not a good period for us. In the next 10 years, the estimates are for that to be better, 2.2% annualized. Still not gangbuster numbers when you compare it against, but it's a victim of scale as well. We also end up being the fastest growing of the advanced economies of scale, really, on the planet. And so of the advanced economies, we were really right in line, and we should be ahead of Europe specifically, I suppose, for the next 10 years. Okay, now, China. China grew at 11.4% on an annualized basis over the last 10 years. That's pretty amazing, right? In fact, if you look at their contribution to global GDP growth, they were 35% of all the GDP growth on the planet over the last 10 years. That's impressive. What's even more impressive is over the next 10 years, the projections are, now maybe the projections are wrong, right? But this is the trend, so let's do some regression. Over the next 10 years, they grow at 8.6%. Well, that's a slower growth rate, but remember they're the second largest economy on the planet now, and their contribution to GDP growth over the next 10 years is actually going to be 40% of GDP growth. And if you take into account the Russias, the Indias, the Brazils, the other developing markets, you can see over the last 10 years, they grew at 6.4% on average, which is the same pace basically they'll run over the next 10 years. But this is what's so amazing. The developing and emerging markets will represent 80% of all the growth contribution on the planet going forward over the next 10 years. That's pretty astounding. But growth rate's good, right? So the growth rate projection over the next 10 years is higher than the growth rate over the last 10 years, which was tumultuous. So then you have to ask yourself a question. Is this good news or is it bad news? Because if those trends continue, then what you'll find is China is the largest economy on the planet. The United States ends up being number 2, representing about 15% of the global economic pie. The EU comes in at 13, so if you bundle Europe together, they get to about 13. Japan gets supplanted by India. India grows to be 8% of the world economy, and finally Japan comes in at 4.2. So the question is, how do you feel about this? Does it make you feel insecure? Does that make you feel vulnerable? Are you excited because there's this much demand coming online? You can probably figure out where I come down.